just happens on this day that the Gospel is very much suited to the saint. It talks about the private room, the praying in secret. Well, the life of this saint, St Romuald, is very much linked with the private room. He had this itch to be physically alone, and I mean alone. He would have this habit of founding a monastery, and then with it he would find inside it a cell in which he would close himself in. It's called a recluse. It's a hermit who actually doesn't go out at all, and to which no one can actually come either. They have been there over the years, over the centuries, in different ways, in different cultures. St Anthony of Egypt for a while was entombed, that is, he buried himself alive in a big tomb. There is, in England specifically, the tradition way back in the Middle Ages of having a recluse walled into a church. They would be at the sanctuary end. During Norwich was a famous one. But then the order founded by this saint, which is actually one of the oldest of the reforms, it goes back to 981 roughly. The order that started with him had this possibility of starting off together in formation with other monks and then going towards solitude. And at Camaldoli itself, the big one that he founded, there is still the cenobium, the big monastery, and then up the mountain, the hermitage. There are little cells which go around and have a church also. Well, the last degree was actually being recluded there. Now, as it happens, there was a link with that situation and that reclusion in the abbey, in the monastery where I was formed for years in France, and it was this. My novice master, Don Simeon, who had entered before the war, he'd entered in 1936, had entered along with some giants of holiness. One was Don Martin, who was a very holy man and became eventually prior of our monastery. But by the time I entered there, he was already with the nuns. He was chaplain to the Carthusian nuns. But he was somebody who hardly ever used the gift of speech. He only talked to God. But people knew that he was very close to God, and when he celebrated, you could see he was almost in ecstatic mode. He was very close to the angels. He was elected prior, and he one day was ministering to the nuns in the convent where he was at that time. He was only in his mid-60s, and he knew something. And we know that he knew something because the Mother Prioress found a note. He had been found dead, but this note was beside him, and it was this: I know that on this day the Lord is coming for me. I leave you my testament. And it was only one line. Le secret de la vie intérieure est le saint silence. The secret of the interior life is holy silence. So, obviously, he had gifts. And what came through was that this absence of any leakage of words and energy meant that all his energy went towards union with Jesus. Hence, it would come out at the altar, that you would see him, as it were, beaming. And he had the internal canonization of the order, because for some very exceptional cases, the order does that. Now, there were 2 or 3 cases similar, but one other one I want to go into was the one that is linked with this feast. It was another one, a great giant of our abbey, Dom Damien. He had already been ordained before entering. He was actually a missionary. I think he was with the Redemptorists. And he had learned even to fly a plane on missions. But then he was called to this contemplative life and entered with us. I hadn't known him, but I know all about him from my novice master. And he was similarly very much into interior prayer and only wanted that. Eventually, after being professed solemnly, he was asked if he would go to another of the monasteries of the order to be procurator. That meant having all the practical things to do. So he obeyed and went off from the south of France, where we were, to Italy, but got to the external part of the Charterhouse of Florence and asked if he could go over to nearby Camaldoli and there become a recluse, because all he wanted was prayer and solitude, and it was allowed. And so he persevered, and he persevered until death. And that actually had a huge effect on me, because I knew that he died there, and I'd seen a picture of his tomb with the word recluso on it, recluse. And something was pulling me. I wanted to take his place. I'll come back to that in a minute. The other great one in our house was Don Mort du Camin. And as you may have picked up in your history, in France, in the beginning of the 1900s, there was a massive anti-clerical movement. The Freemasons got into power, and practically all the monks and nuns were driven out. It was a huge thing against the church. Well, in that also the Carthusians were driven out. And in 1926 already, roughly, ours was the first to be reopened, much longer, much earlier than the Grand Chartreuse, which only came back in secret during the war in the 1940s. So what happened was this. The first prior was Don Morris, and he was very, very, very strict. And he got rid of all the contact with the world, any retreats, anything at all, and meant business. So that was the impetus given to the foundation, which of course is still coming through to what we had. And the feeling was in the air that they meant business. And it was good to be with a community which actually really took everything seriously. I close that bracket and I get back to Don Damien. Well, eventually I went to see Camaldoli, hoping to be transferred there to become a recluse. And I found his cell where he'd lived in reclusion and his tomb. And I could see other tombs as well with the same word on it, recluso, recluso. That was the summit. They could get there if they wanted. However, at that point it didn't happen. There were too many complications, so the story is quite long. And much later in time I was able to get back to solitary life with the Bishop of Meath. But I want to leave you with this. If you compare that, the life of somebody within the four walls of one of these reclusories, with actually what the vast majority of mankind is going through on a daily basis until death, what do we have? We have, if you like, on the map of time, existences all going on the same moment of time until death. We all travel on the same moment of time, and death hits us at different points. At each point of encounter, of death for a soul, there it's all finished. What happens? 1 second later, one sees what matters, really. And average existences happen something like this. All the energy of the soul is going to go through essentially things that are not essential. A few, like these giants, don't waste a single grain of energy or time or grace. All is channeled. Therefore, all the structure of enclosure harnesses, protects, and aims in one only direction. Vastly, humanity is doing just the opposite. It's leaking through all the possible pores. Every soul is poured out all over the place and is not in itself. And at the last second, or rather the first second after the last second, when there's no more distraction, it sees, I wasn't prepared. I've got to start all over again in purgatory, or even worse, I was actually disorientated and aimed against. That's awful. So before we live, let's ask ourselves, where do I want to let my energy go? The choice is huge, but we only have one life. There's no transfer.